August 14, 2011, Osaka, Japan. Early that morning, a man cleaning Higashi Park in the Tennōji district stumbled upon a small metal container. The cleaner assumed someone had left their trash behind and bent down to pick it up. To his surprise, the container was quite heavy, and its lid was tightly sealed with vinyl tape. The man peeled off the tape and opened the lid. Inside, he found a human skull. Horrified by the discovery, the cleaner immediately dropped the container to the ground. After a few moments, regaining his composure, he called the police. Upon arrival, the police cordoned off the park area. No visitors were allowed to leave until they were questioned. A thorough crime scene investigation followed. The metal container, about 35 centimeters tall and 24 centimeters wide with an 18-liter capacity, had been placed near some bushes as if hastily hidden. It bore a blue label from a pharmaceutical company. Inside the container, more bones were found. Investigators questioned the cleaner, who explained that he was a sanitation worker who had come to the park early that morning as usual to collect recyclables. Spotting the metal container, he intended to take it and sell it. That morning, there were only a few people in the park. Some were strolling, others exercising. Several individuals had seen the container, but no one knew who had placed it there. Later that day, at 2 p.m., police discovered a second metal container on a nearby street. Unlike the first, this container was much darker. Inside, more human bones were found. The next day, local residents reported finding a third metal container in a parking lot about 100 meters west of the park. Police quickly arrived at the scene. This third container contained fragments of an ankle. Unlike the first container, the second and third were not sealed with vinyl tape. However, all three containers shared the same design. The remains from the three containers were sent to forensic experts for analysis. After DNA testing, it was determined that the bones belonged to two individuals, a mother and her son. Due to the limited bone fragments, the cause of death could not be established. The forensic team also estimated that the victims had died around 2006, approximately 5 years earlier. Investigators began searching their database for missing persons cases in Osaka. Information was scarce. Only two individuals, a mother and her son, had gone missing in Osaka around 2006. In the records for missing persons from 2006, only two people matched the description: 46-year-old Mitsushiro Fujimori and her 21-year-old son, Yoshiro Fujimori. According to the files, the mother and son had disappeared in April 2006. In May 2006, a man named Yasutaka Fujimori, husband of Mitsushiro and father of Yoshiro, reported his wife and eldest son missing to the police. They had disappeared in April, yet Yasutaka waited until May to alert the authorities. Why did he wait so long? To understand this, we need to go back to 2006 when the events unfolded. In 2006, when Yasutaka filed the missing persons report, he told investigators that he believed his wife and son had likely run away. He hoped they would eventually return home on their own. However, after a month passed with no sign of them, Yasutaka realized it was time to go to the police. Yasutaka and Mitsushiro had fallen in love during their university years. After graduation, with the support of their parents, the young couple married and moved into a new apartment in Osaka. Following the death of Yasutaka's father, he inherited a small printing business which provided the Fujimori family with a steady income. When Mitsushiro learned she was pregnant with their first child, she quit her job, deciding to dedicate herself fully to the family. Shortly after the birth of their first child, Mitsushiro became pregnant again. Over the years, however, the printing business started to struggle financially, and eventually Yasutaka was forced to close it down. After the closure, Yasutaka found work as a department manager at a pharmaceutical company. Despite having a stable job, the family was still struggling financially. The income from the printing business had been much higher, and the drop in earnings was deeply felt. Mitsushiro began complaining to Yasutaka that his salary wasn't enough to cover the family's expenses. Arguments over money became a frequent occurrence in the Fujimori household. During one particularly heated confrontation, Mitsushiro declared that she wanted a divorce and left the house. Yasutaka didn't take her words seriously, assuming she had only said it out of anger. He had no idea that she might truly disappear, taking their eldest son with her. Back in 2006, the younger son of the Fujimori family told investigators that the atmosphere in their household had been quite tense. as his parents often argued over their financial difficulties. His older brother had always taken their mother's side and frequently criticized their father, which led to a close relationship between Mitsushiro and her eldest son, a bond that didn't extend to the younger sibling. On the day his mother and older brother disappeared, the younger son had been on a school trip, so he had no idea exactly when his family had left the house. When police searched the Fujimori home, they found that Mitsushiro's and her son's clothes and personal belongings were missing. It seemed as if they had indeed packed their things and left. Relatives and neighbors were clueless about where the mother and son could have gone. Naturally, the first suspect was the head of the household, Yasutaka Fujimori. However, there was no evidence linking him to any crime, and soon the case was closed due to insufficient leads. After the police closed the case, Yasutaka Fujimori moved away. 5 years passed since the disappearance of his wife and eldest son. It was now August 2011. The remains of Mitsushiro and her son were found in 3 separate metal containers. Witnesses reported seeing a suspicious man in Higashi Park on August 13th, just a day before the first container was discovered. He had been nervously wandering around the park, holding a bag. Investigators suspected that the bag might have contained the first metal container. Thanks to security camera footage, the police were able to quickly identify the suspicious park visitor. It was Yasutaka Fujimori, Mitsushiro's husband, and Yoshiro's father. By then, Yasutaka was unemployed and living alone in an apartment near Higashi Park. His apartment was directly across from the parking lot where the third metal container was found. At the beginning of this story, I mentioned that one of the containers had a pharmaceutical company's label. It turns out that Yasutaka Fujimori had once worked for that very same company. The man became the prime suspect once again. Investigators hypothesized that during one of their frequent arguments, Yasutaka killed his wife, and his eldest son witnessed the crime. Fearing exposure, Yasutaka likely got rid of his son as well. To throw the police off his trail and avoid suspicion, Yasutaka waited a month after their disappearance before reporting his wife and son missing. After the discovery of the containers, Yasutaka was arrested on suspicion of double murder. During his interrogation, he claimed to know nothing about the containers and explained that he had left his job at the pharmaceutical company 2 years prior. He said his health had deteriorated, forcing him to quit his job and move out of the apartment where he had lived with his wife and sons, relocating to a cheaper residence. Yasutaka also claimed that his frequent visits to Higashi Park were not unusual. Investigators found his story hard to believe. There were simply too many coincidences. They suspected that there might be other clues in his home, as only part of the remains had been found in the containers. His apartment was located on the second floor of a 5-story building. Despite thoroughly searching the place, the police found nothing suspicious. Soon after, investigators uncovered that back in 2003, Yasutaka had developed a gambling addiction and squandered all of the family's savings. After losing everything, Yasutaka took out loans from banks, but once again gambled the money away. Desperate to pay off his debts, Yasutaka went to a life insurance company, hoping to cancel his policy and recover some of the money. However, when he tried to complete the paperwork, he discovered that his wife had already canceled the policy. When he returned home, Yasutaka learned that Mitsushiro had done this because their eldest son had been expelled from his school. They couldn't afford to pay the tuition. In secret, Mitsushiro had annulled Yasutaka's life insurance policy to get money for their son's education. Enraged by her actions, Yasutaka lashed out at her for making such a major decision without consulting him first. Investigators suspected that it was during this heated conflict that Yasutaka killed both his wife and son. Fearing imprisonment, he dismembered their bodies, placing the remains in 3 different containers, before moving to an apartment near Higashi Park. Perhaps he believed the case would never be reopened, considering it had been closed 5 years earlier. However, there was a flaw in this theory. The containers discovered weren't sufficient to hide the bodies of 2 adults. Now, returning to 2011, 3 months after the case was reopened, Yasutaka finally admitted to disposing of the containers. Yet he still denied killing his wife and son. He claimed that when he came home on April 10, 2006, the house was dark and unusually quiet. His wife would typically be preparing dinner by that time. Upon turning on the lights, he noticed that the door to his eldest son's room was wide open. When he entered the room, he was confronted by a horrifying scene, His son lay motionless on the bed, covered in blood, with a sledgehammer lying on the floor nearby. Calling out for his wife yielded no response. When he entered the bathroom, Yasutaka found his wife, Mitsushiro, lying lifeless on the floor. A deep cut was visible on her left wrist. Yasutaka believed that in the midst of their dire financial situation, his wife had killed their son before taking her own life using a shard of glass. When investigators questioned why he hadn't reported this 5 years earlier, why Mitsushiro and Yoshihiro Fujimori were considered missing all that time, and how their remains ended up in 3 metal containers, Yasutaka offered a disturbing explanation. He said that at the time his younger son was away on a school trip, and he didn't want him to find out what had happened. Yasutaka transported the bodies to his workplace, where he used an electric saw to dismember them. He placed the remains in 4 metal containers and stored them at the pharmaceutical company's warehouse. When his younger son returned home, Yasutaka told him that his mother and brother had left the house. Years later, Yasutaka's health began to decline rapidly, forcing him to leave his job. Before resigning, he retrieved the containers from the warehouse and brought them back to his home. At the time, Yasutaka's younger son had already moved into his own apartment, and Yasutaka had relocated to a small unit near Higashi Park. His new apartment was so tiny that he couldn't store the containers there, so he decided to leave them in different parts of the city. Yasutaka assumed the containers would eventually be discarded without a second thought, never imagining that the police would soon come knocking at his door. Investigators had numerous questions. If Yasutaka had wanted to hide the crime from his younger son, why did he deal with the bodies of his loved ones in such a gruesome way? Moreover, the 4 containers weren't sufficient to contain all the remains, and it seemed impossible for him to store them at his workplace without anyone noticing. Someone would have surely smelled the decomposition. Yasutaka refused to disclose the location of the 4th container. Investigators visited the pharmaceutical company where he had worked and interviewed his former colleagues. Most of them described Yasutaka as a good employee. He was sociable, and no one ever suspected him of anything suspicious. However, there were some who noticed odd behaviors. Yasutaka was prone to sudden bursts of anger over trivial matters and often mumbled to himself. On one occasion, he came to work intoxicated, and when a colleague offered help, Yasutaka reacted aggressively. The investigators questioned the warehouse manager, who insisted that there had never been any complaints about an unusual odor. Nonetheless, the police conducted a thorough search of the pharmaceutical warehouse, hoping to find the elusive 4th container. In the end, they found nothing. The next stop for investigators was the Fujimori family's former apartment. After obtaining permission from the new tenant, they carried out a detailed search using luminol, a chemical used to detect trace amounts of blood. In one of the rooms, they discovered traces of blood that had been cleaned but not entirely removed. Visually, the room seemed spotless, which is why the current tenant had never suspected anything. Thanks to the luminol, these faint traces of blood were detected. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to the eldest son, Yoshihiro. Despite all the evidence gathered, investigators still needed more to convict Yasutaka. A close friend of Mitsushiro told the police that after Yasutaka became addicted to gambling, he also developed a heavy drinking problem. Nearly every evening he would come home drunk, often passing out right at the door. When his wife and son went missing, Yasutaka didn't seem to care much, and continued living his life as usual. This friend also revealed that Yasutaka had a history of physical abuse toward Mitsushiro, which convinced her that he was capable of getting rid of his family. Investigators questioned Mitsushiro and Yasutaka's younger son, who explained that he rarely visited his father after moving out. Their relationship had grown distant over the years. He said he had never seen any metal containers in his father's home. Though he suspected that something terrible might have happened to his mother and brother, he never confronted his father about it. Public opinion was divided. Some believed Yasutaka was guilty of the crime, while others suspected the younger son. There was speculation that Yasutaka might have taken the blame for a crime he didn't commit, just to protect his younger son from being sent to prison. But why would the younger son murder his own mother and brother? As I mentioned earlier, Mitsushiro had always favored her firstborn son, showing him more attention and care, while the younger son never received the same affection. Over the years, this neglect could have built up into resentment, potentially leading to such a heinous crime. The final straw may have been when Mitsushiro canceled Yasutaka's life insurance policy, just to ensure that Shiro could continue his studies. What I'm about to recount is just one version of what might have happened to Mitsushiro and her son Yoshihiro. Investigators hypothesize that the younger son lied to his father about going on a school trip, only to return home during the day while his father was at work. Finding his older brother asleep in bed, he grabbed a sledgehammer, striking him down. Afterward, he dealt with his mother before fleeing the crime scene. Upon returning home, Yasutaka was confronted with a horrifying scene. He considered calling the police, but it's likely that his younger son called him first to confess what had happened. After a brief moment of reflection, Yasutaka decided to hide the evidence of the crime to protect his son. It is believed that he took the bodies to a remote location at night and buried them. Upon returning home, he cleaned up the apartment and spoke with his son, instructing him to stick to a single story, that their mother and brother had simply left home. A month after the disappearances in 2006, Yasutaka approached the police, but the case was not thoroughly investigated. 5 years later, Yasutaka learned that the land where his wife and son were buried had been purchased by a real estate company, which planned to build a new house on the site. Fearing that human remains would be discovered during construction, Yasutaka returned to the site, exhumed the remains, and placed them in metal containers, which he then hid at work. Since only bones remained, there was naturally no unpleasant odor in the warehouse. Before resigning, Yasutaka retrieved the metal containers, deciding to dispose of them because his apartment was too small to store them. It's strange that he feared the bones would be found during construction, yet left some containers filled with bones out in the open. Yasutaka Fujimori consistently denied any wrongdoing in the crime. 2 years after the discovery of the 3 containers, the case was referred to the Osaka District Court. Because Yasutaka did not make a full confession, investigators were unable to uncover the true circumstances surrounding the deaths of his wife and elder son. All they had were Yasutaka's admissions of concealing remains, his mistreatment of the bodies, Yoshihiro's blood found with luminol in the former Fujimori family apartment, and the false statements he made in 2006. After a lengthy trial, the verdict was finally delivered. Yasutaka Fujimori was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 28 years in prison. His younger son moved to another city, severing all ties with his father and other relatives. Years later, a flash drive containing a video confession from Yasutaka Fujimori about the murders of his wife and elder son was sent to the Osaka Police Department. In the video, he recounted how he had attacked them while under the influence of alcohol. The sender of the flash drive was Yasutaka's younger son. Ultimately, after several years, he forgave his father. Thank you all for watching and for your time. Please share your thoughts about this story in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.